Hello, very happy today we have Dave McCaughan, marketing expert from Asia Pacific with us. Dave has more than 30 years of experience in marketing, and recently he is focusing more on using AI in building brand stories. So today we will talk with him to learn more about this new area.
Thanks, Priscilla. Great to be doing this session with you.
Thank you so much for the time today.
Well, I'm sure that anybody listening to this will know that AI in different forms or machine learning, they are strictly speaking different things, but that whole universe has been playing a bigger and bigger role in marketing in recent years, in different aspects of marketing. One of the particular things I do is help brands build or renew or rediscover what their brand story is and what is the most relevant narrative to build their story around. So a narrative being the basis of a story, the string that keeps things together. And over the last 5 years, what I've been doing is experimenting with and then using in particular one AI platform that helps us really do the market research to understand which narratives are telling or informing people about different subjects, which narratives around which brands are working best, or which narratives brands should be associating themselves with best. This particular platform that I use is based on understanding everything that's on the internet. So in very simple terms, let's say that I want to understand the narrative of Priscilla Chan. And I want to understand what the narrative on the internet is about you. I simply tell the platform the subject matter, I give it your name, to look at it either globally in English or globally in another language, or maybe I just say just in Hong Kong. So let's just say I said Hong Kong English. Then what it will do, it will look at every single piece of content on the internet that has ever mentioned you that exists on the internet today that was looked at by anybody in Hong Kong. Mm. Right? Now, not just social media, so not just your tweets or your Facebook feed. Obviously, it doesn't look at the private Facebook stuff, but anything that's public. But it'll also look anything where I know you've published articles in different sites and magazines. It'll look at all those. It'll look at anything it'll look at this video when it's loaded up. And it reads all of that content. So it doesn't just do like keyword searches or associations. It actually reads the content and analyzes the content of every single piece of content and then aggregates that to then develop a story to tell us how powerful the narrative is about you, which emotions are generated by that narrative, which pieces of content in particular drive the narrative about you, where that information is on the internet, which channels on the internet are the most powerful ones to associate your narrative with. It does all of that. So it's like a giant qualitative exercise, but done by a machine. And it's proved a very useful way to understand the way in which the world of the internet, at least, if you say all knowledge on the internet is a proxy for human knowledge, then this is a way to understand all human knowledge about you or whatever narrative I happen to be working on.
So it doesn't matter which country, it doesn't matter what languages.
No, we have done projects in about 50 plus countries in 40 different languages. Wow. Personally, I've worked on projects that were Hindi in India, Saudi Arabian Arabic versus Egyptian Arabic. Once got asked to do a project using Zulu in South Africa. So lots of different languages, most of the Asian languages, because mostly my work is in Asia. So I've done lots of projects in Korea, Japan, Thailand, where I live, Southeast Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. So all of the major sort of languages in the world have been covered off. And some also, I mean, Zulu, let's face it, is a pretty strange language. So I don't mean strange, but it's not common for most people to have to deal with. So if it's a new language, of course, the people that own the platform have to do a bit of education work. So I just can't ring them up today and say, hey, I want to do something in some language that's never used before. It might take a few days for them to actually educate the platform on that language, etc. But yeah, lots of different experiences in lots of different countries. Yeah.
Very interesting. So, would you mind maybe give us one or two examples?
Sure.
And how does that work?
I can't say which company, but
Mm,
one of the world's biggest beauty companies
okay.
um, asked me to look at their international markets. So they were thinking about the fact that they had at the luxury cosmetics area, they were very successful globally, but not as successful as they wanted to be in their four biggest markets. And their four biggest markets were the USA, China, France, and Italy. Um, and so what they wanted to know was how could they rewrite their brand story um, and the different attributes of the brand to make it work harder against those in those four markets. One of the things I learned in the early discussions with the client was that basically they had a sort of feeling that, oh, well, if it works in France, it'll work in Italy because they're basically the same thing, right? They're right next to each other. They're basically the same thing. Um, Now, that very first meeting when they said that, I laughed because my wife happens to be Italian. And if you said to her she's the same as French women, she'd kill me. So I did say to them, well, I don't think that's correct. And so one of the things we used the platform for was we looked at a whole bunch of issues, beauty trends, attitudes towards that particular brand, its competitors, the narratives around the country of origin of where beauty products come from, etc. And we put that all in and looked at the French internet, obviously, and the Italian internet, all the content. The platform ended up looking at about a bit over 1.5 billion pieces of content, reading all of them, analyzing them, and then what it does is it plots them on a sort of landscape map on your computer screen, where it aggregates all this content under different narratives and then tells you which is the most important, etc. Now, one of the things that we learned from that, for example, was some differences in the way in which Italian and French internet uh, responded to a particular country in Asia as a source of beauty, and it was quite different. It was much stronger in Italy than it was in France. But then what was interesting was we then we took the key learnings and redid the study every month for 15 months. And what we found was there was 2 months of the year in July and August when suddenly in France it became hugely relevant to talk about this particular country as a source of beauty. And the reason for that was we discovered was because maybe you know in Paris every year in August is the world's largest manga conference.
Mm.
And so what happens is that not just for manga followers, but for the whole of the French publishing industry, there's a real focus on stuff that comes from this one Asian country where this brand is based. And so what we discovered was, well, it helped them decide on the fact that maybe they ought to do something more aligned in those 2 months of that country, that maybe the narrative has to shift in different parts of the year because there's different interests in different parts of the year. And also very much so that, no, you have to have a different story to tell in Italy to what you have in France, even though they're neighboring countries. But, you know, it'd be a bit like telling people in Korea and Japan they're exactly the same, right? No, of course, nobody wants to believe that. Right? So that was a very interesting one on a sort of global scale, looking at some global issues. Another project that I recently did was here in Thailand for the Thai post office. And in that case, as you can imagine, post offices all around the world are struggling before the current coronavirus crisis. But over the last 10 years or so, if you're a post office, you're really struggling to compete with the DHLs and all the different courier services and the internet and everything else. So what we did was we used the platform to look at the narrative around the post office, different post office services, the competitors, their services, so that we could cluster. And what we could actually do from that is by looking at all that, and we looked at the machine, looked at about 1 billion pieces of content here in Thailand, in Thai, around these issues, and was able to help identify, well, these are the things where the post office can be competitive. these are other narratives that you can't win on this. You're not competitive, or nobody really cares. They're there, but nobody really cares they're there. So focus your agenda on these things here, these narratives, and then looking at those particularly 3 or 4 key narratives, we were able to understand what emotion was generated by them. So therefore, what frustrations you might have to get over, but also if it was good emotions, what things do you highlight, what kind of language do you use that's working, etc. And then also it helped us understand better what the trade-offs were. So why would you use this service from the post office rather than use this service from UPS or somebody else? So it was and I should say that the thing about all this is, normally, if you're working in marketing and market research, etc., you could do all this sort of work in a sense by doing mass surveys or doing lots and lots of focus groups.
Mm-hmm.
This is much faster and much cheaper. So you're really cutting out a lot of time and expense to get to quicker answers, if you like.
Sure. And I expect it would also help the brands to maybe identify areas that they have not even thought about before.
Yeah. For one particular brand in Japan, which was a chewing gum brand, and like major chewing gum brands in many countries, the basis of their story was freshness, right? Or refreshing feeling. This is a very successful brand in Japan and in many countries, but in Japan, after about 40 years, they were running out of how do you express freshness in a new way, or in a way that nobody has done with chewing gum before. And so we actually did a study where we looked at narratives around freshness and refreshment. And through that, we're able to identify a particular actual Japanese traditional form of refreshment, but it had never been used before by anybody in their broad candy or gum category. And so we were able to direct them and say, oh, that one actually is really powerful. It's a really powerful narrative. Nobody else is using it. Maybe you should make ads using that idea, right?
So in that case, you mentioned that it is also cheaper and faster. May I know, say, for example, if compared with very traditional marketing projects,
sure.
In terms of the duration of the projects, how would it be different?
So normally, if a client comes to me today and says, look, I've got this problem, it's, by the way, of course, it's like any other process, garbage in, garbage out. So realistically, you have to have a meeting with the client to find out really what their problem is, work out what's the input into the platform. So basically, what are the key subjects they want to explore? Are they in the right language? Not just are they in Cantonese or English or whatever, but are they in the right modern version of it? Is it the way people actually say it? Because remember, you're asking the machine to look at the internet and find everything the way that everybody reads. So it has to be the way people would normally type it or say it. And then you run it, and then you get the answers. But the answer to your question is, a client comes to me today, we might go through 2 or 3 days of going back and forth on what the input is. We put it into the machine. The machine does the run, usually in 24 hours. So usually if I have to, I like sometimes to take longer to have a think about things, but I can easily do a full project in a week.
Right.
And, if you were, for example, if you were asking me to do half a dozen or 10 focus groups on an issue, that itself, by the time you brief, you recruit people, you do the focus groups, you get a report. If you do it in 3 weeks, you're really, really lucky. It's probably going to be more. If you're doing a major survey, even if you're doing a major mobile survey, right, the structuring of the survey, the detailing of the survey, the test run to make sure that people that actually understand the questions can answer it properly, all that sort of stuff, you're probably, again, looking at 2 or 3 weeks worth before you actually can do the thing properly, and the expense will be quite high. So again, the expense is a normal project. So the baseline project is about $10,000 US. So your viewers can listen to that and figure out the math. But let me just point out that in most countries, in a Hong Kong, in a Japan, in a US, in England, $10,000 gets you 3 focus groups, right? So think of it that way.
Yeah. And can I say that it also has less bias? Because if you have a focus group or if you have a survey, many times you would be quite confined by the questions that you ask.
Right. I mean, obviously, again, you can be confined by what you put into it. So let me just point out, you don't need to use me. Anybody can go to this. There are a number of these sorts of platforms in the world, but the one I use mostly, you can go online to their site and you can, with your credit card, you can actually run a study yourself today, right? But realistically, what we've discovered is that, if Priscilla comes up, she wants to do a study on who are really convincing conference speakers, and you might have a list of 20 or 30 of who you think are, and it will run that and it will tell you which ones are transformative speakers and which ones are not transformative speakers and all that sort of stuff. But what I found and what the owners of the platform and people I've worked with, these and clients I've worked with, usually it takes somebody like me with a sort of broad experience to sort of sit there and go, you don't ask it that you need to ask it this, this, and this, how you frame it a bit. So it is garbage in, garbage out. So you've got to have a bit of experience to understand what to do with that. Yeah.
So my last question maybe is, would you foresee more use of technology, AI, or machine learning in marketing in the coming future?
Oh, without a doubt, we're already seeing that. If you look at things like a couple of times a year, there's an organization in America called Green Book. They put out what's considered the Bible of the market research world in terms of what's actually happening. And if you look at their last 5 years, you can see there's a growing emphasis on AI, machine learning technologies, etc. Of course, more traditional methods are still much bigger, and they still have a great role. There's still an important role for doing focus groups or mobile surveys, etc. But what we're seeing is the sheer volume of data in the world means that it's impossible for us to analyze it all. And I always use the simple analogy. So that before I got into marketing, I was a children's librarian. So for 10 years in Australia. So my job primarily was to stand in a children's library, and after school, kids would come in and sort of say, I've got to do a project on the Vikings. Can you give me a book that I can use for my essay? But actually, they then say to me, look, do you know why the Vikings used to try to conquer other countries? And what they were really asking me was, could I answer the question for them, right? And of course, when you went to university or I went to university, a teacher would your professor would give you a thing, and you go away and you would read 5 or 10 articles and then write the essay around. Well, the problem is now is we all have access not to 5 or 10 articles in the library. We have access to millions of articles about any subject, and it's impossible for us to all read them all. So this is where these platforms can help do that. And of course, AI is then infecting all levels of the marketing world, not just market research in terms of what are narratives or what's the most powerful storylines, but then the application to programmatic creative, programmatic buying, etc. That's all on the rise. And I suspect that what we're going through right now, because of the coronavirus and the lockdown, is these things are all getting sped up in use.
Yeah.
Right. For example, I can say that the platform I use for market research on narratives, there's one very prominent Asian government that is now running a full study every single day. They've been doing it for over 2 weeks. They're running a full study every single day that's looking at all the narratives around the virus, the crisis, the different government services, and how the virus is affecting the perceptions of those government services.
Wow.
And they would never have thought about doing that, but they've been brought. This is the best way to sort of get instant access to what the world is really thinking. So.
Yeah, if you ask the citizens, they may not give you the real answer, right?
Well, this is the other thing. The other thing is this, and I will point out, this is not social media monitoring. So the danger of social media monitoring is no matter what numbers you throw up at people, and you can say, well, there's 3 billion people in the world use Facebook. That means there's 4 billion that don't.
Yeah.
And of the 3 billion that are on Facebook, not everybody uses it. Not everybody comments. We also know that when people, your Facebook personality can be quite different to your normal personality, right? So we all know people that on Facebook, they're quite cynical.
Yeah.
I have a friend on Facebook, he's really funny. In real life, he's a boring guy. But for some reason on Facebook, he's really funny, right? And so we're never too sure with social media monitoring what we're actually getting. And like you say, if you go and ask people questions, of course there's ways, if you're a very experienced market researcher, you can get around that. But for most people, oh no, I'll just ask a few questions and you get biased answers and all that. So it's not a replacement for all those things, but it's certainly a more efficient way to get to a mass scale of understanding what's going on in the world.
Sure, sure. And I think it's very eye-opening as well to know that it's not just the commercial world is using this, and government services and
oh yeah, I've done work for charities with, or I've voluntarily done work for charities using it, and I have, to your point, I did actually have one time I guess they're not really a speaker service. It was an area in the medical industry that they arranged medical conferences. And they actually got me to do a run of what they thought were the 50 top medical speakers in the world. So we could see what the narrative was around each of those. And I threw my own name in. It was really interesting to do it and find out what the internet thought about me. So it's worthwhile. It's interesting stuff.
For individual as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Greg, thank you very much for the insights today, and I hope we can have more conversation like this in future.
Yeah, I hope so too. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
Bye.